Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the flickering candlelight of Tudor England, where appearances were everything and virtue was a carefully rehearsed performance. But beneath the embroidered gowns and golden crowns, some women dared to defy the script. They played by their own rules in a world designed to silence them, and it's their stories, wild, scandalous, unforgettable, that we'll unfold tonight. So before you settle in, remember to hit the like button if this kind of twisted history is your vibe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey through the deliciously scandalous, sharply intelligent, and occasionally doomed women who turned Tudor England into one long, bloody, chaotic soap opera. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to become legend, but that's precisely what she became. When she stepped into Henry VIII's orbit, she didn't just turn heads, she altered the fate of a kingdom. Before Anne, Henry was a typical Renaissance king, loud, confident, slightly paranoid, and unhappily married to Catherine of Aragon. His appetite for power was only matched by his craving for an heir. But Anne wasn't the kind of woman who accepted her fate with a smile and a curtsy. She had been shaped by the elegance of the French court, where charm was a weapon and wit was sharper than steel. In an age where a woman's worth was often measured by how silent and agreeable she could be, Anne was neither. When Henry approached her with his usual blend of royal flattery and entitlement, Anne didn't swoon. She refused, not cruelly, not dramatically, but with enough grace to make the king believe the chase was his idea, and oh, what a chase it was. For 7 years, he pursued her with the stubbornness of a man convinced he was chosen by God, sending her letters drenched in longing and promises etched in gold. Anne offered little more than cryptic smiles and elusive companionship. The more she withheld, the more obsessed he became. In the end, Henry did what no other English king had dared. He tore his country from the grip of the Catholic Church. All because one woman said no. Their marriage, once it finally happened, was supposed to be a new dawn. Instead, it became a storm. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, brilliant and strong, but not the male heir Henry had demanded from destiny. Disappointment set in like rot. The court, always hungry for blood, whispered rumors. Adultery, incest, sorcery. The charges were wild, the evidence shaky, but logic had little room in a world where political survival was a daily performance. Even Anne's own brother was dragged into the spectacle. Her trial was theater, her death a statement. The executioner came from France, clean, fast, professional. Her final words were calm, composed, devastating in their dignity. History painted her as manipulative, wicked, immoral. But history also tends to tremble at women it cannot tame. Anne wasn't just a mistress or a queen. She was a force that disrupted an empire's foundation. Her influence lingered long after her head fell. England was never the same. In breaking a king, she redefined a kingdom. And in the ashes of her downfall, a new monarch would rise. Her daughter, who would rule with a fire that made Henry look like a footnote. By the time Catherine Howard caught Henry VIII's wandering eye, the king had aged into something closer to myth than man. He was bloated, tired, riddled with pain, and carried the ghosts of failed marriages like armor. But Catherine was youth incarnate. Barely in her teens, lively, playful, with a smile that could melt suspicion. She was everything Henry hadn't felt in years. She was also Anne Boleyn's cousin, a connection that should have screamed caution. But caution had never been a Tudor virtue. Catherine's upbringing had been chaotic at best. She was raised in a noble household that cared more for appearances than protection. The lines between education and exposure were blurred, and by the time she arrived at court, she already bore the weight of past entanglements and whispered affairs. Still, in the grand halls of power, She was cast as the innocent rose, pure, untouched, and perfectly suited to reignite the dying flame of a king's ego. Henry believed he had found salvation in her presence. He called her his rose without a thorn. History, however, would disagree. Their marriage moved faster than a rumor. One moment she was a lady-in-waiting, the next she was queen, adorned in jewels and flattery. But Catherine wasn't built for the brutal chessboard of Tudor politics. She craved affection, companionship, and perhaps most dangerously, excitement. While Henry limped through palace corridors, mourning his youth, Catherine found herself drawn to a charming courtier named Thomas Culpeper. The affair was neither subtle nor wise. Love notes passed hands. Secret meetings were arranged, and all the while, the palace walls seemed to close in tighter. As if that weren't enough, an old flame, Francis Derham, resurfaced with demands and threats. He claimed history with her, a dangerous thing when your current husband is the King of England. The whispers soon grew into storms, and once Henry discovered the truth, or at least enough of it to feel humiliated, he unraveled. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public. The image of the all-powerful monarch, cuckolded by a teenage queen, was too much for his pride to bear. Catherine was dragged from the palace in hysteria, her cries echoing through the halls that once celebrated her. Interrogated, humiliated, and condemned, she faced the same fate as her cousin Anne. Her final words were quiet, filled with sorrow. She admitted she had loved pleasure more than virtue, an admission that became her epitaph. Whether she was foolish, manipulated, or simply too young to survive the world she was thrown into, one thing is clear. Catherine Howard was a girl swallowed by a game that punished innocence as harshly as it did ambition. She became a cautionary tale carved in stone. In Tudor England, love might win you a crown, but desire could lose you your head. And in Catherine's case, both came faster than she ever imagined. Before Anne Boleyn ever dared to flirt with destiny and fracture the English church, her sister Mary had already walked the path of royal temptation. Quieter, subtler, and with far fewer witnesses. In many ways, Mary was the prototype. She had charm without cunning, beauty without the barbs, and a manner that turned heads without igniting wars. Where Anne schemed and resisted, Mary yielded and vanished, and yet her influence left traces all the same. As a teenager, Mary was sent to the French court, which to Tudor sensibilities was less of an education and more of a baptism in scandal. There, she moved among princes and poets, absorbed the elegance of flirtation, and, if the rumors are to be believed, became intimately acquainted with King Francis IV himself, who referred to her not so subtly as his English mare. A cruel nickname, yes, but also one that reflected how Renaissance courts devoured reputations while pretending to be civilized. By the time she returned to England, Mary was already notorious in certain circles. Yet, in the strange calculus of Tudor politics, notoriety was not a disqualification from marriage. She was paired off with William Carey, a well-connected but minor nobleman. On paper, it was a proper match. In practice, he was a placeholder, someone to stand by politely while the King of England took an interest in his wife. Henry VIII, ever the collector of indulgences, began a discreet affair with Mary. Unlike the wildfire romance he'd later pursue with Anne, this was a slow-burning secret. No public upheavals, no declarations, just gifts exchanged behind closed doors, whispers that turned into truths, and at least one child, perhaps two, who may have carried more than just Carey's name. Her son, Henry Carey, so closely resembled the king that court painters reportedly hesitated when capturing his likeness. But Mary, unlike Anne, lacked the ruthless instinct for survival. She didn't push for titles or influence. When Henry's gaze drifted elsewhere, she simply receded. While her sister plotted ascension, Mary was quietly pushed to the margins. Her next scandal came not in the form of a royal affair, but in something far more unforgivable to the elite: marrying for love. Her second husband, William Stafford, was a soldier with neither money nor pedigree. Their union was, by Tudor standards, a social freefall. The court was scandalized. How dare a Boleyn woman choose affection over ambition? Mary was exiled from the palace, cast out not for her sins, but for her sincerity. And yet there's a peculiar grace to her ending. She lived out her days far from the scheming of courtiers, on modest land with a man who loved her. No executioner's blade, no trial filled with lies. Just chickens, countryside, and a kind of peace her sister never knew. In a world that punished women for every step outside the narrow lines of virtue, Mary Boleyn did something radical. She survived. She outlived the throne chasers, the whisperers, the ones who gambled and lost. She entered history as a royal mistress and left it as a content wife, and in the brutal theatre of Tudor England, that may have been the boldest rebellion of all. Before the Tudors turned scandal into a national pastime, there was Jane Shore, a woman whose fall from grace was so legendary, even the Tudors couldn't resist borrowing her story. She lived during the dying days of the Plantagenet dynasty, in a time when the throne itself trembled and kings measured loyalty by the gallows. But Jane wasn't born into power. She was born into respectability. Her father, a London merchant, her world one of ledgers and routine. She married young, to a man whose life smelled of trade and caution. It could have been a quiet life, but fate, as ever, had other plans. Then came Edward IV. Tall, charming, reckless, Edward was everything a fairy tale king should be, and just as dangerous. Jane caught his eye, not because she schemed, but because she didn't. She was radiant, yes, but her most subversive trait was kindness. She was known not for manipulation, but for mercy. While other royal mistresses collected influence and enemies, Jane gave alms to the poor, pled for condemned prisoners, and asked the king to delay executions until after breakfast. She wasn't just beautiful. She was good. And in the ruthless court of York and Lancaster, that made her an anomaly. Her affair with Edward was open, even celebrated by those who benefited from her favor. The church, of course, detested her. To them, she was temptation made flesh, a woman who smiled too easily, spoke too boldly, and forgot her place far too often. But Jane never used her position to climb higher. She never demanded lands or titles. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, Jane lost everything in a single breath. Her protector was gone, and in his place rose Richard III, a man who needed enemies more than he needed truth. Jane became the perfect scapegoat. She was accused of witchcraft, seduction, and moral decay, not because she had sinned more than others, but because she had done it with grace. Richard ordered her to do public penance, and so, barefoot, clad only in a thin shift, she walked through London as a living sermon. But the plan backfired. Instead of shame, the crowd saw suffering. Instead of guilt, they saw dignity. Some claimed the people wept. More likely, they stared in silent awe, unsure whether they were witnessing punishment or prophecy. And yet, Jane did not die. She lived on quietly in the shadows of history. The years were not kind. She aged, faded from memory, became a ghost whispered about in sermons and taverns. But she had endured. She had faced kings, betrayal, and public scorn, and she had walked away with her soul intact. Her true crime, in the eyes of history, was simple. She had a personality. She was not content to be silent, pious, and forgettable. She laughed. She loved. She dared to exist fully in a world that demanded women stay quiet and invisible. Jane Shore didn't seek scandal, but when it came for her, she made it unforgettable. And in doing so, she set the stage for every audacious woman who followed. In the labyrinth of Tudor intrigue, not every scandal wore a crown or carried a sword. Some slipped quietly across a parchment, cloaked in clever verse and knowing glances. That was Mary Shelton's realm. A lady-in-waiting by title, a poet by passion, and a Boleyn by blood. She belonged to a family famous for setting fires they rarely put out. Cousin to Anne Boleyn, Mary inherited the family's signature mix of charm, ambition, and a reckless intimacy with danger. But instead of seducing kings in private chambers, she seduced the court with poetry. Mary wasn't just literate. She was luminous on the page. Her poems, tucked into the Devonshire manuscript, weren't dry sermons or polite hymns to chastity. They were sharp, suggestive, laced with irony and desire. On the surface, they spoke of heartbreak and longing, but beneath the lines, something far more thrilling simmered. A woman playing with the boundaries of propriety, and doing it beautifully. Her verses weren't scandalous because they were obscene. They were scandalous because they made sin sound refined. A forbidden glance, a stolen kiss, the ache of absence. Mary could dress them all in elegant syllables and slip them through the gates of decency unnoticed. At court, her poetry became a form of social currency. Passed from hand to hand like secret confessions, her lines delighted noblemen and unnerved those who preferred their women silent and dull. Some said she even caught Henry VIII's wandering eye, though whether he was enchanted by her words or just enjoyed the challenge of someone who could read and rhyme is still unclear. What is certain is that Mary was quick, observant, and brave enough to say what others only dared to feel. She was never officially a royal mistress, a distinction that, in Tudor England, often came with a countdown to disgrace. Instead, Mary lived in the margins, where the witty survived and the beautiful fell. She played the game with subtlety. Where others schemed, she scribbled. Where others whispered in corridors, she rhymed in salons. Her strength was not in conquest, but in commentary. While her more ambitious relatives chased crowns and lost their heads, Mary crafted poems about their folly, heartbreak, and ruin. And when history came to claim its usual toll on Tudor women, silencing, shaming, or worse, Mary outwitted it. She left behind no broken marriage, no treason trial, no public fall. Just verses, elegant, provocative, and centuries ahead of their time. In a world that devoured women for being too loud, too smart, or too visible, Mary Shelton achieved the impossible. She made people listen without ever raising her voice. She never ruled a kingdom, but in the shadowy courts of desire and intellect, she reigned. In a court where everyone wore masks, Jane Boleyn's face was always unreadable. She was the kind of woman who could glide into a room unnoticed and leave it in pieces. Observant, intelligent, and disturbingly loyal to no one, Jane was born into privilege, but lived in whispers. Her marriage to George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brilliant, arrogant brother, should have made her a power in her own right. Instead, it placed her at the heart of a slow-motion tragedy. Jane and George were no fairy tale match. He found her tiresome. She found him insufferable. Their union was all title and no tenderness. And yet, when Anne began her fatal descent, Jane became a central figure in the unraveling. She testified against both her husband and her sister-in-law, suggesting a relationship between them that went far beyond sibling affection. Whether she lied, misremembered, or simply told the court what it wanted to hear remains one of Tudor history's great riddles. But the damage was done. George and Anne went to the scaffold. Jane stayed behind. Some say she betrayed them out of jealousy. Others think she was coerced. But perhaps the truth is simpler and darker. She had grown used to surviving in a world where survival often meant pointing the blade elsewhere. Whatever her reasons, Jane Boleyn became that rare creature in Tudor England, a woman who outlived someone else's downfall. But the court never forgets a convenient witness. Years later, Jane re-emerged in another royal drama, this time as confidant to Catherine Howard, Henry's teenage bride. The same Catherine who slipped notes under doors and held midnight meetings with the king's handsome groom of the stool, Thomas Culpeper. And Jane, impossibly, was there again. She carried the messages, covered the tracks, guarded the doors. She didn't start the fire, but she certainly fanned the flames. When the affair was discovered, Jane tried to distance herself from the mess she helped arrange. But Tudor justice has no patience for second chances. She was arrested, interrogated, and, according to records, briefly lost her mind. Some said she ranted incoherently in her cell. Others believed she feigned madness to delay execution. Either way, the Crown hesitated. Killing a lunatic was considered poor optics. So they waited. Eventually, Jane was deemed sane enough to die. At her beheading, she offered a quiet apology, not to Catherine, the girl she helped destroy, but to Anne Boleyn, the queen she had once helped condemn. Her final words were a whispered reckoning, the kind that arrives too late to change anything but just in time to be remembered. Jane Boleyn's life was not one of passion or power, but of proximity. She lived close enough to greatness to feel its warmth, and close enough to scandal to be scorched by it. She didn't seduce kings or write poetry. She watched, listened, waited. And when the tide turned, she spoke. Often too much, always too late. In a court obsessed with spectacle, Jane was the stagehand who finally tripped into the spotlight and couldn't escape. In the cold machinery of Tudor politics, there was little room for warmth. Power moved like a sharpened blade, efficient, unfeeling, precise. And yet, in the eye of that storm stood a woman named Bess Holland. She had no noble birth, no famous family, no claim to greatness. What she had was presence, the rare kind that could bend even the most ruthless men without saying a word. Bess became the mistress of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's right hand, a man whose rise was built on the bones of monasteries and reputations. Cromwell was not a romantic. He was a bureaucrat forged in fire, a man who knew the price of power down to the last decimal. He spoke in calculations, trusted no one, and could dismantle a family line before lunch. And yet Bess remained by his side. Some believed she softened him. Others thought she was merely a useful diversion. The truth, as always, is murkier. Bess wasn't loud or political. She didn't demand lands or titles. She simply existed where most women dared not linger, at the heart of influence. She smiled when others flinched. She wore silk while others wore silence, and she knew the one thing more valuable than jewels in Tudor England: secrets. At court, her presence was a paradox. She had no official role, yet everyone noticed her. She laughed too freely, dressed too well, and moved through power as if she belonged. It unsettled people. A woman without shame was dangerous. One with access to Cromwell's ear was lethal. Rumors bloomed like mold. They said she advised him. They said she seduced others. They said she was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost in velvet. When Cromwell fell from grace, betrayed by the king he had served, accused of treason, overreach, and marrying Henry to a woman he couldn't stomach, Bess vanished. No trial, no sentence. No body. One day she stood beside the kingdom's most powerful man. The next, she was gone. Some whispered she fled to the continent. Others believed she paid for her escape in coin or secrets. A few, more poetic than plausible, imagined her in a convent, veiled and silent. But celibacy didn't suit the woman who had once danced through Cromwell's cold corridors like a spark in the dark. What's certain is this: Bess survived, and in Tudor England, that was a miracle. She left behind no portraits, no poems, no confession, only echoes. The courtiers who remembered her spoke of a woman both feared and admired, desired and resented. She never held a title. She never wore a crown. But for a moment, she moved through the center of the storm and emerged untouched. In a world where queens lost their heads and wives lost their names, Bess Holland lost nothing but her trail, and maybe, just maybe, that was her greatest triumph. If ambition had a scent in Tudor England, it would have clung to Anne Seymour like fine perfume, expensive, sharp, and just faintly toxic. She was not the kind of woman who courted power with flattery or laughter. She didn't bat her lashes or flutter her fan. She calculated, observed, and when the moment came, she moved like a blade in silk. Anne didn't smile unless it served a purpose. And in a court where women were expected to be soft, she carved out her legacy in cold precision. Her marriage to Edward Seymour, brother to Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, positioned her at the epicenter of influence. When Jane gave Henry the son he'd spent years and kingdoms chasing, the Seymour name soared. Edward became the young prince's uncle. Anne became something far more potent, the invisible queen of every hallway that mattered. She wore her status like armor and expected others to recognize it without explanation. Servants called her Your Grace, with a kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or executioners. Anne hosted banquets that dripped with opulence. She oversaw palaces that glittered with pride. But beneath the pearls and velvet was a mind that never stopped working. She didn't crave lovers or admiration. She craved leverage. In a court ruled by masculine whims, Anne wielded influence with a surgeon's touch. Her reputation was not scandalous, but strategic. She didn't need gossip to elevate her. She used silence as a weapon and charm as camouflage. When her husband was named Lord Protector for the boy King Edward VI, Anne became England's unofficial queen. But she had none of the softness that made other consorts palatable. She was accused of arrogance, of cruelty, of believing she was above everyone else, which, frankly, she may have been. Her peers saw a woman with no time for games. Her enemies saw something worse, a woman they couldn't control. But power in Tudor England was never permanent. As her husband fell from favor, so too did Anne. She was thrown into the tower, not for treason, not for adultery, but for being herself too efficiently. The crime was never her actions, but her attitude. She was too composed, too clever, too immune to shame. Though eventually released, her influence melted faster than candle wax. Her husband was executed. She lived on, stripped of her authority, her throne of whispers reduced to dust. And yet she had accomplished what few could. She rose without seduction, ruled without affection, and walked through the flames without flinching. Anne Seymour didn't chase admiration. She terrified it into silence. She left behind no scandalous letters or romantic portraits. Just a memory of a woman who didn't giggle, didn't faint, and never apologized for being powerful. In Tudor England, that made her the most dangerous kind of perversion, a woman who simply refused to be less than what she was. By the time Catherine Parr entered Henry VIII's orbit, the king was no longer the golden-haired heartbreaker of his youth. He was old, paranoid, and collapsing under the weight of his own appetites. His leg was a festering wound, his temper a hair-trigger. His past wives were either dead, discarded, or disgraced. But Catherine was something he hadn't seen in years. Calm, steady, rational, and most threatening of all, smart. She had not been raised to rule. Twice widowed before she ever reached the palace, Catherine Parr had spent her adult life managing estates, comforting dying husbands, and reading books nobody expected women to understand. She wasn't young, but she was clear-eyed. She had known love. She had known grief. And when Henry proposed, she knew exactly what kind of storm she was stepping into. Still, she accepted. Refusing a king wasn't just rude, it was suicidal. But Catherine did something extraordinary. She made herself useful. She nursed his wounds, flattered his pride, managed his fractious children, and kept the peace in a court that ran on suspicion. Henry called her his most beloved wife, not because she stirred passion, but because she stabilized chaos. But Catherine Parr wasn't just a caregiver in pearls. Beneath the modest gowns and gentle smiles was a razor-sharp mind. She was a scholar, a writer, and a quiet revolutionary. She supported Protestant reform in a time when choosing the wrong psalm could get you executed. She even published her own religious texts, an audacious act for a queen in a kingdom still wading through theological bloodshed. At one point, her debating grew too bold. Henry, never comfortable with being out-argued by a woman, especially one he happened to be married to, muttered darkly about heresy. Plans were drawn for her arrest. Catherine, sensing that Scripture would not save her, did the only thing a brilliant woman could in the face of male ego. She played the fool. She dropped to her knees, professed that her challenges had been meant only to distract him from his pain. Henry, touched by this calculated humility, forgave her on the spot. The warrant for her arrest was quietly withdrawn. She had survived the unthinkable, but her greatest act came after Henry's death. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine didn't end her days in disgrace or cloistered grief. She remarried, this time for love. Thomas Seymour was handsome, charming, and, as it turned out, spectacularly untrustworthy. But for a brief window, Catherine knew happiness. She hosted scholars, raised Henry's youngest daughter, and even welcomed a child of her own. Tragically, childbirth claimed her in 1548. But by then, she had already rewritten the rules. Catherine Parr was the only wife of Henry VIII to leave the marriage alive, educated, and still fully herself. She outlasted the tyrant, outwitted his court, and carved out a legacy not with seduction or scandal, but with reason, restraint, and quiet courage. In a time when survival was rare and respect rarer still, Catherine achieved both. She was not the loudest nor the most famous, but she may have been the wisest. In a court where the love of a king was a double-edged sword, Bessie Blount wielded hers with quiet precision. She didn't scheme, she didn't manipulate, and she didn't linger longer than the danger allowed. In the grand procession of Henry VIII's many lovers, wives, and regrets, Bessie is easy to miss, but that may have been her greatest success. She arrived at court as a young lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Fresh-faced, well-bred, and blessed with an unthreatening grace, Bessie slipped into royal life with ease. She danced, she smiled, and when Henry noticed her during a court masque, she did not resist, nor did she rush. She simply allowed herself to be chosen, and that, in Tudor England, was its own kind of power. Their affair was soft compared to the chaos that would come later. There were no fiery letters, no threats of divorce, no churches torn from Rome. Just companionship, discretion, and the occasional glance across the great hall that made even seasoned courtiers pause. Bessie was everything Henry adored in a woman at that moment in his life. Compliant, kind, and, most importantly, not married to someone else. Then came the turning point. In 1519, Bessie gave birth to a son. Not just any son, but Henry Fitzroy, a name that declared, without saying it aloud, that this was the king's child. Henry beamed with pride. He couldn't legitimize the boy, but he could honor him. Fitzroy was showered with titles, lands, and tutors. Some even whispered he might be named heir, especially as Queen Catherine's pregnancies continued to end in heartbreak. For a brief moment, Bessie stood at the very heart of Tudor destiny. But unlike others who tried to climb higher, she didn't. She accepted her place, accepted her reward, and gracefully stepped aside. When Henry's attention turned elsewhere, as it always did, Bessie did not protest. She married a quiet nobleman named Gilbert Taleboys, bore him more children, and retired from the drama with her dignity fully intact. She never chased the crown, never begged for status, never tried to leverage her child into court dominance. And perhaps that's why she survived. While other women found themselves dragged into the storm, Bessie Blount had already packed her things and gone home. Even after her son died young, a loss that crushed Henry, Bessie remained untouched by the fallout. She lived to see Anne Boleyn fall, Jane Seymour rise, and the Tudor court consume woman after woman in its hunger for power and perfection. And through it all, Bessie remained a ghost in the background, remembered only when needed and forgotten when it became dangerous to remember. In a world where beauty could be fatal and desire was a death sentence in disguise, Bessie Blount played the long game. She understood the king. She gave him what he wanted, and then, unlike so many others, she left before the cost became unbearable. She didn't fight for glory, she fought for peace, and in Tudor England, that might have been the boldest move of all. By the time Frances Howard arrived at court, the Tudors were fading, but the appetite for drama was still very much alive. The throne had passed to the Stuarts, and while the names had changed, the game remained the same. Beauty was currency, ambition was risk, and a clever woman had two choices: play or perish. Frances chose to play, and she played hard. Born into the formidable Howard family, survivors, schemers, and power brokers, Frances was raised to see the court not as a place of pageantry, but as a battlefield. She was young, exquisitely groomed, and inconveniently married to a man she couldn't stand. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, had status, but none of the fire Frances craved. Their union was cold from the start, politically brilliant, emotionally barren. He was dutiful. She was done. Enter Robert Carr, a favorite of King James I. Handsome, charming, and basking in royal attention, Carr was everything Devereux was not. Frances fell for him with a ferocity that would shake the kingdom. But to be with Carr, she needed an annulment. And to get an annulment, she needed to prove her marriage had never been consummated. That meant airing the most intimate grievances in a court of law. So Frances stood before a panel of bishops and declared her husband impotent. Then, to make her case ironclad, she allegedly arranged for another woman to test her husband's abilities, an act so humiliating and theatrical it bordered on cruel comedy. The annulment was granted. Frances and Carr married. For a moment, it seemed like a victory, until Sir Thomas Overbury, Carr's former advisor, spoke up. Overbury disapproved of the match. Loudly. And in a world where insults carried weight, Frances didn't just defend herself, she struck. Overbury was soon imprisoned in the Tower of London. There he mysteriously fell ill and died. Later, whispers emerged that he'd been poisoned. The scandal detonated. Investigations pointed to Frances. She denied everything, then confessed, then denied again, then claimed it had all been justified. She and Carr were imprisoned in the Tower. Most women would have faded into disgrace. Frances somehow survived. She pleaded, flattered, and persuaded. Eventually, she and Carr were pardoned, though never fully restored. She lived the rest of her life away from the spotlight, her reputation smudged, but her head still firmly on her shoulders. Frances Howard didn't just break rules, she rewrote them. In a world where women were expected to suffer quietly, she chose action. When trapped in a loveless marriage, she risked everything for passion. When cornered, she didn't weep. She plotted, and when the consequences arrived, she wore them like armor. Her story became a cautionary tale, a favorite subject for preachers and poets warning against female ambition. But what they feared most wasn't her crime. It was her refusal to play the victim. Frances Howard sinned boldly, loved fiercely, and when history tried to shame her, she endured. She didn't survive despite her scandal. She survived because she owned it. In the ever-shifting maze of Tudor politics, Margaret Douglas was a woman born to walk the line between privilege and peril. She was the niece of Henry VIII, the granddaughter of Henry VII, and the cousin of Elizabeth I. That meant she had royal blood in her veins, but not quite enough to guarantee safety. In Tudor England, that made her a target with a crown just out of reach. Margaret was beautiful, educated, and bold, exactly the kind of woman who attracted the wrong kind of attention in a court that demanded obedience in lace. From a young age, she understood the power of romance, not just as pleasure, but as rebellion. Her first great love was Lord Thomas Howard, a man of status, intellect, and unfortunately, poor timing. Their engagement, kept secret from the king, became a national offense when Henry found out. Margaret was imprisoned in the Tower, and Thomas, well, he never made it out alive. She was released on the condition that she keep her heart on a leash. She didn't. Her next affair was with Charles Howard. Yes, another Howard, another dangerous liaison, another round of royal outrage. Once again, she was locked away. By this point, Margaret's romantic history read like a cautionary play. Too royal to be ignored, too stubborn to behave, too passionate to survive. And yet, she did. Margaret wasn't stupid, just fearless. She treated the rules like suggestions and her emotions like weapons. She wasn't chasing scandal. She was chasing something she believed in, even if it meant playing chicken with the crown. She fell in love with men who were either politically toxic or already spoken for. She didn't care. Her life was a series of calculated risks dressed up as love stories. But Margaret wasn't all fire and recklessness. She was also a strategist. Later in life, she turned her attention to building a legacy rather than burning bridges. She became the matriarch of a quiet empire. Her son married into the Scottish royal family, and her grandson, James VI of Scotland, would eventually become James III of England, uniting the two thrones that had once torn her life apart. So the woman who once went to prison for loving the wrong man ended up founding a dynasty that ruled for a century. Not bad for someone whose hobbies included treason and heartbreak. Margaret Douglas never wore a crown, but she bled for one. She danced through danger with grace, loved like it was her right, and gambled everything on a future she wouldn't live to see. And when that future came, it wore her blood like a badge. She didn't just survive history, she shaped it, one forbidden romance at a time. If you wanted to provoke Queen Elizabeth I, there were many ways to do it. But few were as dangerous or as effective as simply being letis nollis. She was beautiful, poised, and shared Tudor blood. More than that, she shared Elizabeth's looks, her coloring, and, most dangerously, her taste in men. In another world, they might have been friends, but this was Elizabeth's world, and Lettice made the fatal mistake of marrying the one man the Queen never stopped loving. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Elizabeth's constant companion, her rumoured lover, her shadow at court. For decades, his name danced on the edge of scandal. The Queen never married him, but she never let him go either. And then, in 1578, he quietly wed Lettice, Elizabeth's cousin. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was an insult written in gold and sealed with vows. When the news reached Elizabeth, her fury was volcanic. She banished Lettice from court, called her a she-wolf, and never forgave her. Dudley, of course, was pardoned. Men always were, but Lettice became a royal ghost, alive but invisible. She returned to her estates, not in shame, but in velvet, living as a queen in exile. Her marriage to Dudley was reportedly affectionate, though it came with the usual Tudor curses. Mountains of debt, whispers of poison, and enemies too numerous to count. And when Dudley died, Lettice did something unthinkable. She married again. this time to a younger soldier, Sir Christopher Blount. Elizabeth, now aging and increasingly brittle, took this as another slap in the face. Blount would later join a rebellion against the crown, and though Lettice was not directly involved, she was briefly imprisoned because proximity to rebellion was enough to get a woman hanged in Tudor England. But Lettice refused to break. She had outlasted the Queen's wrath, the death of her husband, the scandal of her marriage, and the political fallout of her second. She wore survival like a coronet. While Elizabeth aged in isolation, burdened by the myth she'd built around herself, Lettice lived on in the country, surrounded by her children and the ghosts of those who had dared to challenge the throne and failed. And here's the final twist. She outlived Elizabeth. The Virgin Queen died childless and alone. Lettice Knollys lived to the absurd age of 88, an eternity in Tudor years. She saw the rise of a new dynasty, one that descended, ironically, from her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Lettice Knollys never ruled, never wore a crown, never commanded armies or signed treaties. But she committed a sin Elizabeth never forgave. She loved the Queen's favorite man and lived long enough to see all the fire die out. She didn't need a throne, she just needed time and the patience to outlast everyone else. Mary Stuart came into the world not with a whisper, but with a crown. She became queen at just 6 days old, an infant monarch in a storm of swords. From the moment she drew breath, destiny laid out a path paved with gold, blood, and broken hearts. Where Elizabeth of England was ice and calculation, Mary was fire and instinct. The world would remember them both, but only one would keep her head. Born into the chaos of Scottish politics and betrothed into the splendor of France, Mary spent her youth in gilded halls, learning Latin and fashion, music and charm. She was stunning, tall, graceful, with a charisma that seemed to melt rooms. France adored her. She spoke the language like a poet and dressed like a queen of myth. But her life was no fairy tale. Her first husband, the sickly French Dauphin, died young. Barely out of adolescence, Mary returned to Scotland, a country that had no interest in poetry, perfume, or delicate grace. The nobles mistrusted her French ways. The Protestant factions eyed her Catholic heart. But Mary, ever bold, met them all with the poise of a woman who had ruled since infancy. Her second marriage was to Lord Darnley, handsome, charming, and profoundly unstable. Their union was a disaster carved in gold leaf. Jealous, petulant, and drunk on power, Darnley accused Mary of infidelity and plotted in shadows. The court watched with sharpened smiles. Then, in a twist that even the Tudors would have called excessive, Darnley's house exploded. And as if that weren't enough, someone made sure he was strangled for good measure. Enter James Bothwell. Rough, rugged, and accused of everything from assault to conspiracy, he somehow became Mary's third husband. Whether she was coerced, desperate, or truly loved him remains unclear. But their marriage united Scotland in hatred. Her enemies rose, her allies vanished, and Mary, the queen born in silk, found herself fleeing for her life across the border.
She sought refuge in England, hoping her cousin Elizabeth would offer sanctuary. Instead, she got a cell. Mary had a claim to Elizabeth's throne, a fact no one, least of all Elizabeth, could ignore. For 19 years, she was held in elegant prisons under polite guard, writing letters, stitching embroidery, and plotting. Always plotting. She became a symbol to Catholic rebels, a threat to Protestant England, and an obsession to her captors. Eventually, her letters betrayed her. A conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth was uncovered, with Mary's name scrawled across it. Whether she orchestrated it or merely allowed it to bloom in silence, the outcome was the same. Mary, Queen of Scots, was sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom. She walked with dignity, prayed with conviction, and forgave her executioner. When the blade fell, it didn't sever her legacy. It ignited it. She became a legend. The tragic queen, the passionate fool, the martyr, the fire to Elizabeth's ice. Mary didn't rule wisely, she didn't survive long. But she lived as if destiny were a dance floor, not a battlefield. And even in death, she commanded a kind of reverence that the living could never quite match. She didn't outwit fate, she seduced it. By the time Elizabeth Tudor took the throne, the Tudor dynasty had already eaten itself alive. The women who came before her, mothers, cousins, rivals, lovers, had bled, burned, or vanished. She had watched them fall like dominoes. And yet she endured. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her head before Elizabeth could even form full sentences. Branded illegitimate, shuffled from palace to palace, taught to smile through danger and kneel when necessary. Elizabeth grew up knowing that survival required silence, strategy, and steel. When her half-sister Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth was handed a kingdom fractured by religion, rebellion, and fear. But she did not flinch. At 25 years old, unmarried, childless, and mistrusted by nearly everyone, she stepped into the spotlight with a spine carved from fire. She declared herself married to England, a line meant to comfort her people, and to terrify every foreign prince who thought he might claim her throne through her bed. She flirted like a diplomat, fought like a king, and ruled like a woman who had seen too much to be naive. Her court became a stage, and Elizabeth played every role: virgin, mother, goddess, tyrant. Her red wigs became taller, her white makeup thicker, her gowns heavier. The older she got, the more she became a myth, and around her they all died. Mary, Queen of Scots, executed after years of plotting. Lettice Knollys, banished for stealing Elizabeth's favorite man. Catherine Parr, dead in childbirth. The Seymours, the Boleyns, the Howards, either executed, forgotten, or broken. Even the men fell away. Robert Dudley, her beloved companion, died. Essex, her arrogant favorite, betrayed her and lost his head. One by one, the names faded, the rivals vanished, the fires burned out. But Elizabeth, she remained. Until she didn't. In her final days, the glitter cracked. She refused to sleep, refused to lie down, as if she knew that surrendering to the bed would mean surrendering to death. She stood for hours in her darkened chambers, wrapped in old silks, a ghost of the girl who once danced before foreign ambassadors like a living banner of England. When she finally collapsed, she left no heir. No children, no sisters, no brothers, just silence. But her legacy thundered. She had turned a fragile, bankrupt, fractured kingdom into a global force. She had made herself larger than life, a virgin queen ruling not through bloodline or husband, but through intellect, manipulation, and raw presence. She didn't close the Tudor story with a whimper. She ended it with a crown, still firmly on her head. History remembers the loud, the luminous, the doomed. It immortalizes queens who lost their heads, mistresses who birthed scandal, and monarchs who bent empires to their will. But not every woman in the Tudor world played her part on a grand stage. Some stood just outside the spotlight, watching, waiting, enduring. They were ladies-in-waiting, nurses, scribes, laundresses, governesses. They braided the hair of queens about to die. They delivered love letters from mistresses to kings. They wept quietly in corners as another woman was dragged down a hallway toward judgment. They witnessed everything and were written out of nearly all of it. There was Jane Rochford, sister-in-law to Anne Boleyn, who fed the king's paranoia and later recanted, only to go mad before her own execution. There was Margaret Bryan, governess to Elizabeth, who served royal children like a mother, and received little more than worn titles and late payments. There was Catherine Carey, cousin to Elizabeth, rumored daughter of Henry VIII himself, who carried royal blood in her veins but never dared name it aloud. There were maids who whispered behind tapestries, midwives who saw royal births and royal deaths, and widows who lived long enough to bury 3 queens. These women never plotted revolutions or signed edicts, but they carried the weight of the crown all the same. They held the hands of the condemned. They arranged the veils over trembling brows. They inked the last words of monarchs too weak to write. They bore witness to history and were repaid with silence. But they mattered. They were the reason the court functioned. They were the quiet presence in a world of spectacle. When queens were executed, they dressed the corpses. When rebellions broke out, they hid the children. When poison passed lips or betrayal bloomed in letters, they saw it all and lived on. In the end, history crowns the bold and the bloody. But if you listen closely to the margins, you'll hear them, the unnamed women who outlived queens and outlasted kings. Their lives weren't grand, but they were real. And without them, none of the others would have made it to the next act. They were not rulers, but they were survivors. And in the Tudor world, that was perhaps the greatest power of all. She should have worn a crown. By blood, Arabella Stuart had more Tudor in her veins than most who ruled. Granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's sister, Arabella was the living embodiment of two kingdoms forever circling one another, England and Scotland. And in the anxious decades after Elizabeth I's childless reign, that made Arabella both dangerous and doomed. She was beautiful, polished, brilliant, and worst of all royal. From her earliest years she was watched, not nurtured, not groomed, just observed. Every step, every word, every smile was weighed for signs of ambition. She knew the rules of court, but she also knew the darker truth. When your bloodline makes you a threat, even silence becomes suspicious. Elizabeth I kept her close, but never close enough to rise. Arabella wasn't permitted to marry. Not because she was unworthy, but because every marriage was a political grenade. A husband could turn her into a claim. A child could become a rival heir. So she waited and watched for decades. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England, Arabella hoped for relief. After all, they were cousins, kin, but James saw only danger. She was still unmarried, still royal, and still alive. That was enough. So she took her fate into her own hands. In secret, she married William Seymour, a man with his own royal blood. It was a love match, but also a match made in dynastic hell. Together, they represented a rival line to the throne. Their union was seen not as romantic, but as treasonous. They were arrested, separated, locked away. Arabella, now a prisoner, tried to escape. She disguised herself as a man, boarded a ship, and nearly made it. Nearly. She was captured and returned to the Tower of London. Her husband escaped, but she never saw him again. She wasted away behind stone and silence. Ill, isolated, and slowly unraveling, Arabella's letters grew frantic, sometimes lucid, sometimes not. She begged to see her husband, to walk in the garden, to be remembered. No one listened. She died there at 39, without a crown, without a child, without a funeral that matched her blood. But here's the truth. Arabella Stuart was a queen in everything but name. She ruled no lands, but her life was shaped by power, fear, and inheritance. She wasn't undone by rebellion or ambition, but by simply being born too close to a throne she never asked for. History buried her under the weight of almost. Almost queen, almost free, almost remembered. When Anne of Denmark crossed into England in 1603 as queen consort to James I, the Tudor throne had died with Elizabeth, but the shadow it cast still lingered. The kingdom was tense, expectant, and suspicious of foreigners. Anne was Danish, Catholic-born, and proudly difficult. She arrived not to fill a void, but to reshape the stage. She was no Elizabeth. She didn't command councils or turn her virginity into statecraft. Anne's power worked differently, quieter, but no less potent. Where Elizabeth ruled with language and law, Anne ruled with image and art. Her court became a canvas. Her performances, her weapons. Anne wasn't just a queen. She was a patroness, a producer, a performer. Under her gaze, court masks flourished, lavish, allegorical spectacles of dance, music, costume, and symbolism. She played goddesses, virtues, stars. In one mask, she emerged from a shell like Venus. In another, she was Astrea, the bringer of golden peace. These weren't just entertainments, they were political theater. Anne used the stage to project authority, to claim space, to speak when council chambers excluded her. But for all the glitter, Anne's life was not simple. She married James when they were both teenagers, a marriage arranged more for alliance than affection. Over time, their bond grew complicated, marked by long separations and quiet bitterness. James surrounded himself with male favorites. Anne surrounded herself with those who respected her intellect and dignity. They lived in different palaces, often communicated through intermediaries, and disagreed on nearly everything: religion, court appointments, even how to raise their children. Yet Anne never yielded. She refused to convert to Anglicanism, choosing instead to worship privately in secret Catholic rites, a choice that nearly cost her crown in Protestant England. She fought fiercely to control the upbringing of her eldest son, Prince Henry, battling her husband over tutors, staff, even housing. When Henry died young in 1612, Anne broke. Her health declined, her spark dimmed, but she did not disappear. She turned inward into deeper patronage. Painters, poets, architects, they all found welcome in her orbit. Inigo Jones, England's first great architect, found his vision in her service. Ben Jonson, the playwright who often wrote for her masques, filled her court with words meant to shape kingdoms. Anne never held a scepter, but she held influence, cultural, spiritual, symbolic. And when the Queen's house at Greenwich was designed, the first pure Palladian structure in England, it was hers, a monument to taste, to power disguised as elegance. When she died in 1619, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, but without fanfare. Her husband did not attend the funeral. England was already turning its eyes toward a new war, new factions, new dynasties. But Anne had already done her work. She was the last great queen to inherit the world the Tudors built, a world of female power negotiated in whispers, poses, gowns, and glances. She did not seek to dominate like Elizabeth, nor to submit like Jane Seymour. Instead, she created her own vocabulary of sovereignty, one rooted in culture, aesthetics, and performance. Anne of Denmark ruled not by force but by presence. And in a court filled with men who ignored her, she answered with stages that could not look away. From Catherine of Aragon to Anne of Denmark, from the Spanish princess to the Danish queen, we have traveled through over a century of survival, seduction, blood, brilliance, and unrelenting fire. These women were not footnotes to kings. They were the story, the heartbeats beneath thrones, the architects of fate. Some lost their heads, some lost their children, some lost their names, but not a single one, not one, was truly powerless. History tried to silence them. We just listened anyway.